Welcome to Mooney Reads. Today I'm going to be talking about the best nonfiction that I read in 2023. If you watch my previous videos, you may notice that I am back again with in the same sweater with the same blanket because it's the same day and I'm on a roll. So while I'm crocheting the blanket that has stitches that represent each of the books that I read this year, I'm going to be talking about my favorite nonfiction. This is another one that's a top 11 list, but what sort of top list would it be if there weren't like extras thrown in there? I mean, top 11 is already extra because it's usually top 10, but I have some bonus ones to talk about, so I'm going to go roughly in order from like the bottom to the top, so number 1 is going to be last. But if I'd made this list on a different day, it might look a little bit different. That's just how it is. I'm extremely indecisive and bad at picking favorites. The first few things I am going to talk about separately because of the medium. I didn't really know where to put it on the lists just because they are so different. These are all poetry, and one of them is technically a play. Poetry is usually, at least big collections like that, are usually based on the author's experience. One of these is like a poem, but also a play, but I would imagine it is informed a lot by the author's life, and since it's kind of a poetry collection, I was just going to mention it with the poetry. So, in no particular order, or actually no, I will talk about them chronologically, because that's the easiest. The first one of these that I read this year was For Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. This is a choreo poem, so it's kind of a play, but it's written as a poem. This is a look into several different Black women's lives, kind of talking about the Black woman experience, generally speaking. It looks at love, at incredible loss, and it is just so beautifully done. I read it, then read the introduction, and was able to watch a performance of it online. And I definitely recommend that. It was cool to see like the written version, and then to see how it was changed in the version that I watched, but also kind of knowing how it's like adapted is super cool and interesting. But this is beautiful, very intense. I actually couldn't watch the last couple of scenes because I knew what was going to happen because I'd already read it once, but absolutely incredible. The poetry collection that I read quite a while after that, I did not read nearly enough poetry this year. That's The Man with the Night Sweats by Thom Gunn, and this is a collection written by a gay man who was in, I think, San Francisco in the 90s and late 80s. This was published in the early 90s. And so he's writing about basically the experience of being in community during the AIDS epidemic. The way that this was laid out was really smart and kind of focuses on different things as you go. And I mean, it's really dark, understandably, but it was just really well, not just, well written. Like, some of the poems were nice and everything, but the way that it was constructed overall, I think I was even more impressed with. And then the, I think, only other poetry collection that I read was These Godforsaken Notes by Hoover. And this collection focused on the author's experience being a queer, neurodivergent, disabled person. It talks in so many different ways about queerness and memory. There's so much joy and so much like incredible pain, like right beside each other. It is beautifully done. And as really sad as a lot of it is, it's also not hopeless. This one is put out by an independent publisher. The only reason I knew about the book is because I'm acquaintances with the author. We're Facebook friends and have seen a little bit outside of that. And I had seen their poetry on there, and I think I probably saw them perform live once forever ago. So I was able to anticipate it that way, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. But if you like queer poetry and poetry about disability, if you like good poetry, definitely pick this one up. Okay, so that's the poetry that I read this year, which is honestly, like, any of that could have been, I think, in my top list, even if I hadn't taken it out. I don't know, I wanted to still be able to talk about my other books too. I'm bad at making decisions. I'm gonna talk about one more bonus book because it wasn't necessarily in my top, but I really liked it and I got super into it. It's Don't Call It a Cult, which is about the cult NXIVM and its cult leader, who was an awful, terrible person who just, the book starts at 100 and it just gets, like, weirder. As a book, because if I start to, like, really talk more about the cult and the guy, I will absolutely go down a rabbit hole. It's fascinating and terrifying and says a lot of things about society as a whole. But the book was very compelling. It was well written and from what I could tell, well researched. The author talked to multiple people who were involved in the court and was actually involved in the cult and was actually at the court proceedings for the cult leader, who is now in prison for life because of a lot of things. I think he's mainly in for trafficking, but there's also, like, involvement of minors and things like that. So with everything I read, I feel like there's, like, you should read trigger warnings. And my Storygraph is always in the description, so you should, check that out. Storygraph in general is good about having content warnings available, but also in all of my Storygraph reviews, I try to put the content warnings. This is going to be a big one that you'll want to know that for. But this is really fascinating and very disturbing. And if you are into culture, true crime in any capacity, I would definitely recommend it. And now, 13 minutes into filming, my top 11 nonfiction books. So at number 11, I have Like Literally Dude. I don't know why I had to say it like that. Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in a Bad English by Valerie Fridland. And this is kind of a look through history linguistically. It's looking at how language changes, and it's looking at certain quirks of language, how they're added and who's adding them. So it looks at the fact that women tend to facilitate actual, like, innovation in language, as well as other minority groups, which I think for instance, people who use the internet could probably see, like, AAVE coming into the mainstream. It's kind of clear who the linguistic innovators are, but this looks at an even, like, kind of a longer scope of history. It was really fascinating. I thought it was really compelling. I'm also very interested in linguistics already, so but I do think it's accessible even to someone who doesn't have any sort of background. It does get into the weeds a little bit in a couple of places, but I really liked it overall. I listened to it on audiobook, and I had a really good time with it. I think it's worth noting too that the author is, like, a linguist, like, she's a professor, so that's a really good perspective to have. And it was cool that it's, it's by someone from academia, but it's not too jargony. Like, I think it's pretty accessible, so it was a good balance in that regard. At number 10, I have Hey Hun, which is about multi-level marketing. And in the moment, I truly don't remember if I read Don't Call It a Cult or Hey Hun first, but regardless, they are both adjacent to each other and both adjacent to my cult TBR. This is a memoir that also incorporates other kind of research and things, looking at multi-level marketing and looking at cults. She uses the BITE model to kind of talk about the, for lack of a better word, cultiness of the MLM that she was involved in. She doesn't ever say the organization that she was involved with, probably because of the possibility of getting sued, which they would probably do, and they probably have enough money for, because they get a lot of money by taking advantage of moms. But this is very fascinating. Like, I didn't really know too terribly much about multi-level marketing going in, but it's suffice it to say it was like scary. Some of the stuff that she saw and how she was involved. And honestly, one of the big things that surprised me, or I guess it didn't really surprise me, but it's just not something that I think I totally put two and two together with, but it was actually the role of alcohol kind of in the setting. And one of the things that got her out of this cult, I meant to say out of the MLM, but like, yeah, I guess one of the reason that she was able to kind of see how weird everything was going sober, because she was able to see with a clear mind, and wasn't as involved with certain, I guess, social things in the same capacity. In spot number 9, I actually just wanted to talk about the trans comic anthologies that I read, because I read 2 of them and they were both very good. The first one that I read was When I Was Me, which is a comic anthology that focuses on gender euphoria. All of the comics are about a page-long spread, and they're from people all over the world. I read this with the Queerthology Book Club, and was actually invited to write a post for them, the wrap-up post, and that was a lot of fun. The other book that I read, the other trans comic anthology that I read, is called The Outside, and this kind of focuses on sort of like coming out, I suppose. Coming out, being out, self-discovery. This one was also very good. I did like that this one had longer comics, or like different lengths. But overall, I enjoyed both of them, and definitely had artists to look a little bit more at from both of them. In spot number 8, I have My Body is Distant by Paige Maylott. I was actually sent this review copy by the publisher, and it made it to my top list. This memoir kind of focuses on the intersection of several things for this author. It looks at her transition, as well as her relationship with technology, and her experience with cancer. It is non-linear, and I think that the kind of use of non-linear storytelling is really beneficial. I know sometimes that will be used and it's like, it doesn't really have to be that way, but this one, I think it was used very well. I also really like how a lot of the scenes that are online are narrated the same as though they were offline. Now, I had a lot of thoughts on this. From the perspective of someone who has been in community with a lot of trans people, interviewed trans people for like social science research, I have seen and understand the sort of role that the internet in particular can have for trans people. And it's really cool to kind of see it in this way. And I also think that this book is really important because of what she's able to talk about with her experience with disability as well. She talks about her experience with cancer. She also talks about kind of the after and some of the effects of treatment, including the fact that she has a stoma, actually impacted how she was able to get treatment or like medical access for transition. So there's a lot of really cool stuff in there. I really liked how it was written. So highly recommend it. So in the next place, I have Palestine by Joe Sacco. And this is a graphic memoir that talks about the author's experience being in Palestine. He's going through and basically interviewing a bunch of people. He's a journalist. And you're getting the narration of these various people's lives, while also seeing his experience being in Palestine. So you're seeing kind of the conditions that folks are living in, especially like at the end of the book, he visits a refugee camp, and it was really powerful, and I think is really important, especially since conversation around Palestine is much more central in people's minds right now. And there's part of it that I struggled with initially, but I think in the end, after reflecting on it, I think it's really clever and really good, actually, and I like that he put it in there. The way that this is all framed, he's there in Palestine, and you're getting to see his perspective, but he also inserts his opinions about various things. There are some parts where it's kind of misogynistic. There are parts where he's like wanting people to hurry up, and this kind of serves as, I think, the framing of Western journalism in a lot of ways, not necessarily reflective of what he's doing or thinking. I thought that it was very clever and very insightful in, again, a very important piece in understanding kind of what we're seeing, not just like what's happening in Palestine, but the way that it's presented. In spot number 6, I have The Groundings with My Brothers by Walter Rodney. This is a collection of essays looking at Black Power and African history and its role specifically in Jamaica. So there's a lot of things going on in this book. You're getting to see the current moment, the 60s, I believe, getting a lot of the discourse around Black Power and information on kind of the ways in which it was co-opted by a more, less revolutionary, more like capitalist kind of mindset. And you're also seeing the importance of history in a very particular context. It speaks a lot to how we can understand and use history and the just how necessary it is. Walter Rodney was a teacher, but he had kind of a different perspective than most people in academia, and is kind of like learning with and from the people around him. And he speaks a lot on the necessity of this happening in community and kind of the place where activism and education kind of meet, where that's really necessary. As I was editing the video, I realized that I forgot number 5, Taking Turns, which is a graphic memoir that talks about the author's experience becoming a nurse in the, I think, late 80s or early 90s, and working in an AIDS ward in the early 90s. So this would have been through the peak of the U.S. AIDS epidemic. This serves as not only a memoir of her, but also a kind of history of the AIDS ward that she worked in. And she incorporates some oral histories from folks who worked or volunteered there. And she also incorporates some graphics with some figures and information. So this paints a particular picture of what kind of the peak of the AIDS epidemic looked like in a really well-equipped hospital, and it was still very bleak. This is really great in terms of being like a piece of history, but a big part that was really compelling to me was also how she was able to talk about grief. One of the things that kind of actually separated this ward from others, you know, among other kind of technological things and probably other parts of how they ran things, was that kind of in the center of this was this art therapy room. And this touched everyone in the AIDS ward. So the people who were dying could engage in art in these ways, and the author also finds solace in that and is able also within the text to like kind of talk with some of her coworkers about how to handle being in the middle of that much death. And this was interesting too, also juxtaposing it with The Man in the Night Sweats, which I read in the same month as this, because that was just a very bleak picture of the AIDS epidemic, because that's where they were. If this book had been published when she had started and was in the middle of being in this AIDS ward in 1992, which I believe is when Man with the Night Sweats was published, it would look very different. Not to say that this shied away from kind of the horrors of the AIDS epidemic, because it didn't. It did kind of talk about that gratuitous amounts of death and what it was like to be in a ward of people who were basically, who were terminally ill, eminently so. But I also came away with a lot from their discussions of grief and things like that. And then, of course, you also get to see kind of the arc towards, where there's more accessible treatment, and there aren't so many people sick that they even need the ward. The ward dissolves by the end of it, and I think she moves to like a cancer ward or something like that. So this was really well done and left me with a lot to think about. I would definitely recommend it for anyone who really likes a graphic memoir. It's really great in that respect, but it's also a good, I think, starting point for people interested in the AIDS epidemic, because it does paint, it gives you kind of briefly the facts and then puts you in kind of a story around it. So especially if you're not as much of a nonfiction reader, I think this could be helpful there. In spot number 4, I have A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid. This is a memoir. It's a memoir of the author, but it's also a memoir of Antigua, which was formerly one of the British Isles that was, eventually did gain independence. But this is looking at how the colonization still impacts the place. And this is a very short book, but very powerful, and written in a very interesting way. The first section of it is actually told in second person, but it's like second person, but you're the tourist of this place. And it talks at length about the things that would be missed, as well as the things that they would observe or think. And then after that, you go into the actual discussion of the history of the place and how the author, the author's experiences of that. It was really brilliantly written, and one that I kept thinking about throughout the year. In spot number 3, I have Miss Major Speaks, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary. Miss Major, I think, is talked about most often as someone who was there during Stonewall. But she talks about how she was involved with much more, and it also talks about the problems of the way that Stonewall is currently situated. But it is really incredible. She talks about everything from the issues with how Stonewall is framed today to her time in jail, being revolutionized in jail, in prison. She talks about her work with various organizations and having to take certain things into her own hands. Her just work in the community, with other sex workers and things like that. So there's a lot in here. It's not really told in a super linear way. It's more of a series of interviews. You literally do feel like you're just like sitting on her porch talking to her. It was really compelling and just has just so much really great insight into queer history and how it's impacted the moment that we're in now. We're going to stay with queer history in spot number 2 and spot number 1. But I'm having the same issue that I had when I made the list to begin with, which is I don't know which one to put as number 1, and it like pains me a little bit, but it's literally spots number 1 and 2, so you'll hear about them either way. But I'm just going to talk about them at the same time because I can. The best books that I read in 2021. Wow, what year are we in? The best 2 books that I read in 2023 were both queer histories written by Jewish trans people. I have Transgender Warriors by Leslie Feinberg and The Big Reveal by Sasha Velour. I also read these really soon after each other, and they are wonderful to pair together. They talk, like, some of the histories that they have intersect, and some of them, it, like, one fills out information that's not in the other, and they both take slightly different approaches, but they complement each other so well, and they both have memoir components that are also both done differently, but I'm obsessed. Transgender Warriors was published, I think, in 98, so this looks at the history of trans people. They look at Indigenous trans people, they look at trans and gender non-conforming people in Europe, and in particular the role that some of them had in battle. They also talk about their own relationship with history and how they learned about it, and it kind of integrates Leslie Feinberg's experiences figuring themselves out, and there's also a bit of, I think, kind of, maybe class consciousness is maybe like not the exact right word, but like just their experience of queer history and the importance of it to them, and kind of ends talking about the importance of trans people in these various movements, and the necessity of trans liberation to all other liberations. It's incredible. The Big Reveal looks into similar history because she's actually looking at drag, the history of drag, which of course would greatly overlap with trans history, history of nonconformity. But she also digs deeper into like more contemporary history of drag, as well as looking at other things like Indigenous ideas of gender and different things like that. She also incorporates a memoir element at a greater length, I think, than Leslie Feinberg does. Like, there are more chapters kind of about it, and she also talks about her grandmother who encouraged her from a young age, kind of in that way. So there's kind of more of a memoir element, but there's still a really strong history element. This also incorporates kind of an element of art critique or art discussion. She talks about camp and kind of what that is. There's so many different topics going on in here, but it's amazing. Both of these also incorporate photography, so you get these, well, actually in The Big Reveal there's also a comic that bookends it, which is really cool, but in both of these you'll also get to see some of the people that they're talking about, and other folks in the community. If I keep talking, I will be here all day. I'm pretty sure I talked about both of these in my mid-year wrap-up or what have you, so you can also probably hear more about it there. But this was incredible. I highly recommend both of these, and reading them together. And the thing that makes this really cool too, not only are they talking about like slightly different but very overlapping histories, there's memoir element in both of them, there's a visual element in both of them, They're both by Jewish trans people, but they are written in such so far apart. This was published in the late 90s. This was published, I think, in 2023. And yet they're still so similar in a lot of ways. I don't know. I have lots of thoughts. I have lots of feelings. But you should read both of these. This ended up being a very long video, so hopefully it's okay that I talked about literally all the poetry that I read and then just a shitload of books. Those are my favorite nonfictions of 2023. In the comments, let me know if you've read any of these, and or tell me about your favorite nonfiction from last year. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.